Hey guys, coming in for the Man in the High Castle, Season 1, Episode 2, Sunrise. And finally, guys, finally I can review another episode of this show. I mean, you guys remember, I watched the first episode back in February. I absolutely loved the pilot. It impressed me so much. I wanted this to be a series immediately. Thank God Amazon made this a series. Just thank God. It was amazing. It was an amazing pilot, and I really want to see more from the show. And this episode was just as great. I absolutely loved it. Now, I had some times to watch this show, but I figured I'd watch it now because the actual rest of the season premieres Friday. So I'm glad they put this episode up with the first one because I think it's equally as great as the first one. I don't think it's, I don't think it has the, new feel. I think it still feels like a brand new show. It still feels very fresh and I really loved it. There's so many things to love about this show and there's so many things that this show is getting away with that other shows just wouldn't. And let me just say first of all that I'm very happy this is an Amazon online series because there are some things happen in this episode that I really think if they were to happen in other episode if they were having other TV shows they really wouldn't be allowed to air on TV, honestly. I'm happy about that. But let's get in this episode. So much happened in this episode, and I loved it, honestly. I thought it was great. At first, I thought the episode was a bit rushed, but then I realized what was really going on, and I loved it. Amazing twist in this episode, but let's just get into it. So right away, as we know, at the end of the first episode, if you guys remember the first episode, it was back in February, so I really had to refresh my memory. Luckily, I did rewatch the first episode before this one, which I was happy about because one, it was a great premiere. Two, I didn't really remember what was happening except for a few key details. But Frank, we see, as we know, he was captured. By the Japanese. He's in a van. He's taken by Japanese authorities. They yell at him in Japanese, beat him up, and it's really crazy already. So Juliana's in a hotel room without Frank. She doesn't know that Frank, she definitely misses Frank. You can tell she does. But of course, she doesn't really know that her boyfriend is captured right now. So she gets up, sees Joe. She goes up to meet with him. And now, as much as we know that Joe is not to be trusted, the thing is, these two have really great chemistry. That's the real thing here that's really interesting. I mean, we know that Joe obviously is working for the Nazis, but I was most interested in his character, of course, because that twist at the end of the first episode, which was amazing. But the thing with Joe in this episode is that it really feels like these feelings he has, his friendship with Juliana is pretty genuine. It seems like he kind of actually does like her a bit. So she asks him if he couldn't sleep, and he says no. She says she couldn't either. He asks if the room is okay, and she says she has to find a way to pay him back, and he says to not worry about it. He asks if she feels like a drive, and she asks to where, and he takes her to a bridge to watch the sunrise, which is why this episode was called Sunrise, and he says that they don't get sunrises like this back in Manhattan, and she agrees. She looks down at the view, and she sees this bridge. Now, that bridge is actually very important, and just the little details in the show, that's things I like. So they drive back and he takes her to a diner, which he admits isn't really for Sunrise. He has one question for her and he asks if there's a Mr. Trudy. Now remember, she's not pretending, she's pretending to be Trudy right now. She has to she has to protect her cover and pretend to be Trudy. So she does tell him that there is a Frank and he asks if he is her husband and she says that's two questions. She asks him what a guy like him is doing around with a truck and he says to ask him something else. He says he's just following his father's footsteps and she asks what he'd like to do with his life, if he could do anything, and he says just about anything else. And very interesting what he said there. So she thanks him for the sunrise. He asks her where she's going and she says she's going to eat back and she says for him to wish her luck. She goes into the diner, and the man says if she wants to eat, she needs to pay first. She says the sign on the window says that he needs a waitress, and he asks if she plans on staying there. And she says she doesn't know and she could use a job. He says he'll think about it, and she said there's nothing to think about. He's got a job, and she needs one. So she basically plans on working for this man, which I thought was interesting. But it does help her protect her cover, obviously, because, she can't really admit why she's there. So her doing this little side job is very smart. And you really see how smart Juliana is in this entire episode. She really is a smart character, I have to say. That's something I really love about Juliana as a whole, is how smart she is. So Joe goes into a bar and is told a call came for him and there's no message. And then we go to Greater Nazi Reich, Long Island, New York, and we see a lot more of John Smith in this episode. Now, we saw John Smith in the first episode, but I feel like we really didn't get a character from him in that episode. Here, John Smith is going to be one of the best characters on the show. I really love his character, I have to say. as much of a evil man he is, and as much as he supports Nazism, it's really interesting what they do with this character. We see this family, they sit down to breakfast, and the son of the family, Thomas, is a Nazi, and his father is John Smith, and he asks if they're ready for the day ahead. He asks Thomas why his book is open at the breakfast table. He says he has a test today and did study, but there's a boy in his class, Randolph, that he doesn't want to get a high score because of how annoying and eccentric he really is. He wears his hair past his collar, challenges teachers in class, and John says that he is a nonconformist and asks Thomas why he wants to succeed and why he wants to do well at school. He says he wants to make his family proud and bring honor to his school and serve his countries. And John says his goals are directed outward. A boy like Randolph wants only to gratify himself, and this is the path to moral decay. He says the decadents ruin the country. If you guys don't know what the decadents are, they were a group that clearly the Jewish didn't like very much. I looked up what they were. Basically, they were like this group that was just very different from everyone. And clearly, John, believes in Aryan Ray. He clearly believes in that because he doesn't want anyone to be different. And he says he will grow to be a useful member of society, grow to help make their nation stronger. And Randolph will not, whatever his test score may be. And he gives him permission to study at the breakfast table, but just for this morning. And he then answers a call, and it's Joe. And you really see the vulnerability in Joe. Joe is not this evil man, which is something I really like about Joe in this episode. He seems like he's much more vulnerable, actually. You really see a difference between him and John, because John, of course, is his Obengruffer, basically, and he asks where he was, and he says he couldn't sleep. He went for a drive, and John asks if his contact approached him, and he says they haven't yet, and he says they must be assessing him to make sure he's not a Nazi agent, and he says they received intelligence this morning and believed a courier has been covering cargo from San Francisco, and he tells him it's a woman, not a man, and they don't know if she has been to Canyon City, but he is to report in immediately, and if he sees her in it, he asks if she's carrying a film, and he asks who said he was carrying a film, and he says he checked the cargo, wanted to make sure it was safe, and he says those were not his orders, and Joe asks what's so important about the film. Now, this scene where he's like, those are not your orders, this was actually really creepy, I have to say. Joe asks what's so important about the film, he says it's not important to ask, he is to satisfy himself with orders, and asks if he understands. Joe says he does, and he says he's performing a great service for the upper land, and he hangs up. Now, like I said, that scene was definitely filled with tension, and I really loved it. Really intense stuff there. So Frank is in the prison, and a bunch of Japanese soldiers come in. Frank has some of the most heartbreaking scenes in this episode. They really did a good job with not doing too much too soon. I didn't feel like they did too much in this episode. I can understand some people felt like they did, but I felt like they really needed to show the brutality of the world very well. And I mean, it's not really something they can't show. I know some people are thinking maybe they're doing too much, but no matter what happens, they need to show the brutality of this world and why this world is so bad, and you really see that in this episode. So a bunch of Japanese soldiers come in, tell him to strip, which he reluctantly does. I mean, they're telling him to do this against his will, and Cadeau then asks him why he's not circumcised. Inspector Cadeau we see a lot more of in this episode as well. He asks why he would be, and he says they've examined the records of his grandfather. He says his grandmother was Christian, so his mother and father, so was his mother and father. And Cadeau says the Jews don't get to decide if they're Jews, and he says he doesn't care since there are no Jews in Japan after all, but the racial laws are now in line with the Reich, so it's not just him that should be exterminated, but also his sister Laura and her children too. So pretty much now they want to take out all these families, obviously, because, they want to make sure there are no Jews in Japan. The only way to do that is just clear out the entire family. So Frank says they can. He says the law. He begs him to stop, and he says he could overlook it if he cooperates for him, and Frank agrees and asks what he wants. He says he knows what he wants. He wants the film explains how Trudy gave it to Juliana, who has now fled, and he asks where Juliana is. So he clearly knows who Juliana is, and obviously Frank doesn't really know about any of this. He doesn't know that Juliana, he knows that Juliana fled, but he doesn't know any of what happened to her. Like, he really doesn't know where, he knows obviously where she is, but she doesn't know where he is, so it's really interesting here. So Juliana looks at a card that says Sunrise and hides it as a man comes in and asks for her service. She pours him coffee and asks what he's reading, and he says it's a Bible. She says, and this was very interesting, just this little scene here. It seemed like a little thing, it ended up being very important, but I really like this here. She says she hasn't seen one since she was a little girl, and he hands it over, tells her to take a look, and she says it's lighter than she remembers, and he says it's King James translation, since he preferred small print, and she says they are forbidden in the Pacific States, and she asks how he got it. He says she can't find a lot of things in the neutral zone, and it's interesting because, obviously she's been in this place where the Japanese have taken over. She's lived her life there mostly, and at this, right, and she's never really seen a Bible since she was little, obviously, because of the way the world's been. So Joe plays the harmonica, turns on the TV, and there's nothing good on besides cartoons, and some shows in Japanese, and he looks at the film, and I was wondering if he was going to actually watch this film. It was very interesting. So Tagomi goes to the Japanese authority building where he meets with John and Obenfuhrer Deals, and Tagomi has deals what his concern is, and he says they understand he has arrested suspects smuggling subversive films once produced by the so-called man in the high castle before his death. And Cadeau says there are rumors he could still be alive, and the ambassador says he's dead. He says they understand that their fourth suspect fled with the films. They were smuggling a woman, and Cadeau says he seems very well informed and asks what else he wants to know. He says that they assume she fled to the neutral zone, and they need to know exactly where. So basically, John says if he doesn't find the woman, they will, and they ask him if they're clear. He says to be aware they're on Japanese soil, and obviously, I like what Tagomi says. I mean, they don't get to talk down to him because this is their turf. I mean, honestly, they should not be there. The world's supposed to be separated, and the fact they have to join forces already is definitely giving me major conflict. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens here. And of course, Tagomi knows what happened here. He saw everything. He saw Juliana take the film. So the big question is he actually going to do this, or does he want to help her? Because we know that Juliana, like I said, is tight with the Japanese. The Japanese don't want to hurt Juliana. They really don't, because they know how much she respects them, how she doesn't really think they're much of a threat, and it's really interesting overall how she feels about the Japanese. So basically, we then see that Dale says the Ray recognizes the sovereignty of Pacific states, but this is a matter of security. And basically Dale's and John leave, and the stranger asks Juliana for the check, and she gives him money. He tells her that about the reading he read about which all says all life under the sea is futile, so they could dedicate their lives to what's beyond the sun. And she asks him what's beyond the sun. He says the Japanese say it's the emperor himself beyond, which there is only duty to one's country, self-sacrifice. The Nazis, however, say there's nothing at all. So he wants to find out what the neutrals say, because it's pretty clear that Juliana is neutral. She obviously doesn't agree with the Nazis. She kind of agrees with Japanese, but she's in the neutral zone. That's what she is. She's neutral right now. And it's very interesting where Juliana really stands. I mean, it really seems like she kind of stands her own ground here. So basically, he says there's nothing at all, and she asks what he says, and he says to read chapter 12 of verse 5, and gives her the money to pick up a copy at the bookstore. And John tells one of his colleagues, Erich, that he spoke to Joe this morning, and Erich says he should have been contacted, and John says it appears his contact was being cautious, and Erich asks if they suspect, and he says they suspect everyone. They talk about the man in the high castle, and he says no one could make him film such as sophisticated as that. It just didn't really seem like it's possible. I mean, especially because this is supposed to be from like a very unknown person, so they don't really think it's true. So he said he's heard strange rumors that that Hitler considers the films a threat to the very existence of the Reich, and that's why he's so obsessed with them. So I thought that was very interesting. The little reference that they have to Hitler still shows that yeah, Hitler's alive. He could be, he still has, his what does he have? He has some, I can't remember what he has, but he's dying as we know, but he is still alive, and I like seeing that. Obviously, I don't like seeing that Hitler's alive, but it keeps us interested definitely, because we know that Hitler's still out there, and we know that Hitler obviously wants to get rid of the Japanese so that way it can be full-on Nazis. That's clearly what they want. So as they drive, they're suddenly ambushed by the Japanese, and Erich is fatally shot. John gets out, shoots at them as Erich dies. He takes out his gun. Then explosion occurs. The men get away except for one, which John arrests, and that scene was insane. Honestly, an insane scene. It's not the scene that I don't think they couldn't show on TV. That I think is something they could show on TV. I'll get to the stuff that I don't think they could show. So, at Frank's job, his coworker Ed is concerned since he hasn't phoned in sick and he won't pick up Ed's calls. He asks him if he wants to check and see if Ed is okay. He tells him to go on and promises he will dot his pay. And Frank is chained up naked and gets a visitor from a man named Randall, who says he is the one that gave the film to Trudy. So he's claiming that he is the man in the high castle. I'm like, seriously, we already met the man in the high castle? It's clear this man is kind of full of shit. I mean, we've never seen him before. I'm pretty sure this is not the man in the high castle. It's not really him. So he says he's not a friend and needs to tell them he had nothing to do with this. He says he can't. He asks who he is, and he says he's a man just like him. He wants nothing. He says he wants nothing from him. And Frank clearly just wants to get out of this on his own. He doesn't want anyone's help. He wants to do this on his own. It's very interesting. So Randall says it takes a lot of effort not to be free, keeping his head down, his mouth shut, and Frank says he's fine with that as long as he gets to live. And Randall says there are things that are more important in his life, and he knows, such as knowing where Juliana went. He asks what he knows about that. He says he should tell them, and Frank says they'll kill him anyway. He says he should tell them to see what happens. If he can believe, they'll keep their work. And basically, Juliana then asks her boss if she can take a break, and he gives her 10 minutes. She goes to the bookstore, and Joe sees her. She goes to the man working there. She tells him she's looking for a Bible and asks what made her think he had that. And she says someone told her he did. She says they're not illegal. And again, it's a very strange world to think of someone not having a Bible. But this is a world where religion, you can't practice free religion. I mean, that's very interesting to think about. And I think all these little things, they're just very little details. But again, this is all a world where basically these writers can do whatever the fuck they want. And I love that. I mean, yeah, it would make sense. They want this Aryan ray. The Nazis want an Aryan ray. They want to keep things within that Aryan ray. And part of that is they don't believe in religion, clearly. So he said that doesn't make them illegal. Legal. She asks if he has one. He goes to find the book and gives it to her. She pays him and leaves. And John then asks a Nazi Lawrence how Erich is doing. He says he's in critical condition, and Lawrence says that Erich's vehicle has gone missing. John asks when. He says he was last seen crossing the Pelham Bridge at 8:41, and no sign of him or his driver since. So he's disappeared. We don't know where he is, but he's disappeared. And John says they need to coordinate an attack, reprise those from the resistance leader they killed. And he asks who the man he apprehended was, and he says he's a Jew known as Doc Jason Meyer, and he doesn't understand how, despite them wiping out the Jews, they keep coming back like ice. And obviously they don't understand that a lot of these Jews are hiding out. They don't want to say that they're Jews. And John says Lice will assassinate Nazi officers and to never underestimate him. And this is very interesting. I mean, you kind of understand why John thinks they're such a threat. He really thinks that because there's so many of them and there's not as many Nazi officers, that eventually they're going to take over. That's really interesting. That I definitely like. I don't think they're trying to get us to necessarily sympathize with John. I think they're just trying to get us to understand why they are going after, the Jews, because obviously it is a dangerous mission, obviously, what they're doing. I mean, obviously, it's not really legal what they're doing. It's obviously, it's the way of the way Hitler is doing things, but you have to wonder, why wouldn't they just stay neutral? Why do they want to do this? And that makes perfect sense why. I mean, Hitler's kind of brainwashed them. That really is what's going on here. He's brainwashed them and made them think that they are the enemy, which is really interesting. So he says he varies his route every day, and he knew exactly where to find me. He doesn't know, but he intends to find out what's going on, and that's gonna be very interesting to see what happens there. So Randall goes to find Frank. He knocks on the door and asks him if he's in there, but Frank doesn't respond as he's trying to break the chains. He's trying to do it on his own, and it's just not working. He asks if this was all worth it for his film, and he says it could change the world, and he says it changed his. Randall says they torture them because the film shows the world not as it is, but as it could be, and Frank says in this world they flatten DC with an ape bomb. Yes, we basically find out they flatten DC, which is crazy. But that would make sense, obviously, because no president, then you can have this total just dictatorship. That makes perfect sense. So he asks how the film is going to fight against that, and he says they will. Frank says they are dead, which, by the way, guys, let me just say, there is no president in this world. It doesn't seem, at least, that there is a president in this world. So Frank says they are dead enders in the resistance and asks how many of them are like 7, 10, 12, and he asks if they really think they will defeat the Japanese and the Nazis. He says, of course, and he says it is not the way it looks from there. And, Frank is just really looking at things in a realistic way. While it's clear that Randall's really not. He kind of sees things in this way he wants to, but it's not necessarily true. And Randall says evil triumphs only when good men do nothing, and I do agree with that. I mean, obviously, you need to have at least one good man to step in there and stop evil from doing something. A good conquers evil. Good always conquers evil. That's not necessarily true. I mean, the situation they're in, I don't know if that's really going to work here, but I do like the way that Randall's looking at this. So Joe goes to the bookstore, asks the clerk what they got for kids, and then the man asks how old the boy is. And Joe says that he's 10. He shows him the Adventures of Huck Finn, and Joe says he's never heard of it. He gives him money. He asks what Juliana bought, and he says he doesn't remember a woman, and he is obviously trying to protect her cover. So Juliana reads over the passage and then calls Frank, unaware of his capture, and it's a really sad scene because you're pretty sure that she's probably going to do this a lot this season. She's not going to know where Frank is. Frank's going to be off doing his own thing. She's going to have no idea what's going to happen to him, and I feel like things are going to end up really bad between Juliana and Frank. It's really sad, but because of a scene like this, I really feel like this is something that's going to happen a lot of the season. So Tagomi smokes, and he meets up with Rudolph, who has brought him something. And of course, Rudolph, as we know, is that guy he's working with. Rudolph says it's a textile sample, finest Swedish craftsmanship, and Tagomi says their distributors will be delighted. And this really shows why Tagomi, I think, is actually a really vulnerable character, and you actually really do care for him. He says he trusts his visit has been uneventful, and he says it was until he received his call this afternoon. He asked why he's been called. He says his meeting must be canceled since Deals is determined to find the man in the High Castle. They did not inform them, the smuggler, that, but they knew, and he says it's clear they have infiltrated their security services, and he says the risk is too great. He asks if he knows how long he worked to organize this meeting and the risk he has taken to come there, and he says he understands. He says he doesn't think he does. He says since Hitler is ill, he could die, and when he does, there will be a war between their empires. And Tagomi says there will be another time. He says he cannot travel twice on a forged Swedish passport. He will be shot, and you can definitely see here that Tagomi, I don't think, is scared of the Nazis, but I think he just can't say no to them. I mean, think about it. They're very powerful. They're against the Japanese. They could kill them. I mean, he really can't say no, honestly, even though clearly Rudolph wants him to, he just can't say no. So Tagomi says to deliver them and give him the secret, and he asks him what will happen if they tell him not to go through with that. He said himself, destiny is in the hand of man. He's afraid this time that means him, because Rudolph is not going to listen to the Nazis, while Tagomi clearly is. But again, Tagomi really understands the world better than Rudolph does, and that really makes me think that I think Rudolph's going to get killed off. I really see that happening. So I think Tagomi, wants Rudolph to help, but Rudolph, I think he obviously wants to turn against the Nazis, which is a good idea in the long run, but it could end up getting him killed, and because of the world, it's not going to be a good thing in the long run. So Laura and her children, John and Emily, are approached by Kadu, and he thanks them for coming. Laura says they weren't given much of a choice, and Laura asks what this is about. He says that it's just a formality, which we know it's not. We know that they're there to die, and they sit in the waiting room, and Cadeau goes to Frank, who tells him that they're a beautiful family, and Frank asks what they're going to do. He asks if he's heard of Cyclone D, and basically what they're going to do is they're going to gas them. They're going to gas chambers, and even though concentration camps clearly aren't around anymore, they do basically the same stuff as concentration camps. He says they know about Trudy and the film. They even know that she took it to the neutral zone. They know she was on a bus. They just need to know which one. But of course, Frank doesn't really know all this stuff, because remember, he was captured when Juliana left, so he really doesn't know much of what's going on here. So he asks Frank if it's worth dying for a woman who thinks he's a failure, who doesn't even love him, and some guards beat up Randall. And Cadeau says he's a social deviant, but he is a loyal subject of the Empire. He can live a long and prosperous life. He leaves him to think it over, and Frank probably has one of the toughest decisions I've ever seen on TV in a long time, honestly. I mean, really, this is a tough decision here. I mean, either he has to basically blow the cover of the woman he loves, and she has to die, or he doesn't reveal her cover and his entire family dies. I mean, really, it's a very tough decision here, and it's gonna be terrible either way. So some basically, like, Joe then listens to records, and Juliana then gives the man coffee while Joe waits for her, and she tells the stranger she bought the Bible and would like to discuss it with him, but not there. Joe takes the record off, goes out to look for Juliana, and he finds her in the diner, and he says he can't see that he can see she's got the job, and she says she did. He asks about the man that just left, and he says she doesn't really know him well, and she agrees, and John then gets a call from Joe, and he asks if he's been contacted, and he tells him that there's a man there, and we realize that he's not there to talk to Juliana. He's there to clearly investigate this man. They clearly think this man's suspicious, and it's very interesting. So basically he thanks her, and basically we see that he says he asks if he's in contact, and he thinks it's what he's looking for. He apparently makes origami birds, and Julian then comes in, gives him his money. He thanks her. She says she was wondering if she could ask him a favor. There's a man she needs to go see, and if for some reason she can't make it back, she needs him to give an envelope to Anna, her mother. But of course this is going to blow her cover, because obviously she wrote this as Juliana. I don't really think she's thinking about this right now, but I think she didn't really think that through. So he says he'll do it, but before he can finish his sentence, she leaves, and I think he was going to warn her about the man. Definitely, that's what he was going to do. So John and Emily then watch TV, and her son asks how long they will be there. She said, now this is not John like John Smith. It's confusing. Her son's name is John, and then there's John Smith. It is confusing there, but she says they'll be going home soon. She goes to the door and tries to get someone to open it, and this is when she's realizing that they're probably going to be trapped there. They're not getting out of there. They're obviously going to stay there, and they're there for a reason, and obviously you really see the fear in her in this scene. I mean, it's a really terrifying stuff to watch. This is the kind of stuff, like I said, they probably could not show on TV. I mean, gassing someone, yes, but gassing children is really pushing it, and it's really hard to watch, and I'm very happy that they decided to show it, because obviously it makes it that more effective, and I think they did a good job of really showing that. Now, of course, they don't actually show it, but you pretty much know what's going to happen to them. So Randall tells Frank it's a tough choice, but either way someone he loves dies, or many they all do, and or maybe they all do. He said they're scared the film can bring the whole thing tumbling down, and it doesn't matter what they believe anymore, then it matters whether he thinks he's a Jew, and he wouldn't blame it if he didn't. Most people would say would to save innocent lives. They don't want to admit, obviously people don't want to admit that they're Jewish in this world, because obviously it's going to get them in gas chambers. They know what's going to happen to themselves. So he says all the torture, lies, and blackmail, that's how they stay in power. He says this ends only when people like them refuse to obey, no matter the cost. They beat him, and he tells them to not let them take his soul. Frank says to let him go, but they don't listen. Joe then opens up the envelope and reads the letter that Juliana wanted to give to Anna, and basically realizes everything that's going on with her. And he realizes right away this woman he thought was Trudy is really Juliana. And this doesn't really seem to upset him. I really don't think this upset him that much, because I think he clearly cares about Juliana, even though, and I think you really see that here. I think he honestly does care about her. He really cares about what's going to happen to her, and that really shows in this next scene, which I'll get into. So he breaks into the theater, finds a projector which has the film. Cadeau then tells Frank he needs his decision now or never where Juliana is, and Frank says to just kill him and not his family. The Japanese come in, hold him down, and Joe watches the film and then sits in bed. He gets a call from John. He says they've looked into the contact of of um of the man that makes the origami, and he's very dangerous. He's an undercover agent for the SD, not one of theirs, and has eliminated quite a few subversive, and he says to steer clear of him because obviously he's a very dangerous man. So Joe then gets his gun ready, and you see here that he actually does want to help out Juliana, and if he didn't care about Juliana, he probably would not have done this. He probably would have killed the man, but he really would not care about Juliana's safety. So Frank is taken by the Japanese as Laura, Emily, and John sits, and you know that they're about to get gas. You know it's going to happen. The Japanese get ready to execute Frank. They put a bag over his head, and Juliana goes to the bridge to meet with the origami man. He comes in. She says she wanted to make sure they were alone. The Japanese are with Katie. Of course, as we know, Katie is that woman that stole Juliana's bag, and we find Juliana's bag, which is filled with fake films, realizing that they have been chasing a dead end. So all the films in there were fake. However, I have to say, guys, I think the film that Juliana has is real. I don't think that's the fake one. I think all the ones in that bag were fake. So clearly Trudy did this, clearly Katie did this to protect Juliana, so they don't think Juliana is the one that's doing this, which I thought was very smart of Katie, because obviously we need to know why did she take her bag, and now we know. She filled it with decoy films, so that way Juliana is safe, and I really like the way she's doing that. So they put a bag over Frank's head as Laura and her family sits. The stranger asks Juliana for the film. He says, excellent work, proceeds to throw her over, but Joe comes in time with his gun ready, but Juliana throws him over, and that was just so badass when Juliana did that. Again, you really see how strong a female character she is. The fact that Joe was going to kill him, but then Juliana killed him on her own, that was awesome. So Frank is then released because of the mishap, and Joe tells Juliana it's just him, and tells her everything is going to be okay, and he gives her his jacket. They get away. A note is left on the pavement, and I don't know what this note is, but it seems like it's really important. So then we get to the end of this episode, which was just heartbreaking. I thought the end of this episode was really sad. I really felt bad for what happened at the end of this episode. So Ed is there and tells Frank that he said he could go home. Caduce tells Frank that Katie was arrested. He asks about his family, and Caduce says that they found it out too late. He's told he's free to go, which Frank is outraged about, as the entire capture has pretty much been completely unnecessary. I mean, they killed his family. Think about this. They killed his family, even though, I like what Caduce says, that he suffered enough and he's not a monster. Yeah, bullshit, you're not a monster. Obviously, you're targeting these people. Caduce doesn't really think he's doing anything wrong because it's just his job. I understand that. But Frank says if he ever needs more Jews to kill, he knows where to find him, and Caduce says that he does, and that's how the episode ends. So overall, guys, really heartbreaking stuff. I really felt bad for Frank in this episode, definitely. What I like about Cadeau and John is that they're not bad people. They're simply just following orders. They're doing what Hitler has told them to do because they clearly admire him. They see him, he's kind of gotten into his head, that he's brainwashed them. They're now Nazis. That's why this is all happening. It's very interesting to see what's going on there. Now let's talk about Frank. What is going to happen? Is Frank going to be able to protect himself? I'm not really sure. I'm pretty sure that I'm pretty sure that Randall was a phony. I don't think he actually is the man in the high castle. Is he? I don't think he is. I think this was all, I think this was all fake overall. Although Katie clearly only did this again to protect Juliana, so this is not fake, obviously. And I'm wondering if Randall really is the man in the high castle. I don't really think he is. We'll have to see, because I don't think he is yet. We'll have to see though. Juliana and Joe, very interesting, because like I said, I think Joe genuinely cares about Juliana, even though he's there to kill her and obviously go after her. I think he really does care about Juliana, and we'll have to see what happens with that. It's gonna be very interesting to see what they do with that. What's going on with Katie? Obviously, the Japanese eventually are going to have to find out that Katie is just trying to protect her, so we'll have to see what happens with that. That definitely is going to be interesting to see what they do with that. What is John going to do about these Jews? Obviously, he wants to put a stop to them. He wants to find out why they keep living, and what happened to Erich, obviously. Obviously, Erich's, stuff was stolen. His vehicle's gone. We don't know why, and we'll have to see really what happened with that. I felt really bad for Tagomi in this episode because, like I said, he's just following orders. He's gone into the head, the Nazis have gotten into his head, and he really doesn't understand what's going on, and he really doesn't understand how severe this all is, and it's gonna be very interesting to see what happens with that. I felt really bad for him this episode, obviously for Rudolph too. Do you think Rudolph's gonna die? I mean, I hope this works out well for Rudolph, but I'm not very hopeful about this. I really think that things are gonna go badly for Rudolph. Let me know what you guys saw this episode. I thought this was an amazing episode. I absolutely loved it. I already love this show. This is definitely going to be one of my favorite shows of the year. I can already tell just from this episode I'm going to love this show. Let me know what you guys saw this episode. Like I said, I loved it. And we'll see you guys in my next video, which will be for Homelands. And we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.